This will be the joint meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Housing Authority for Tuesday, October 14th, 2008. Ms. Buchanan, can we call the roll?
Council members
Council.
Najarian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver. Here. Yusefian.
Here.
Mayor Draymond.
Here.
For housing.
Authority members Draymond.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Harazian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chairman Yusefian.
Here.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's hear the item, please, or let's hear the report, pardon me.
The agenda for the October 14, 2008 joint public meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, October 9, 2008 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you very much. And can we hear the item at 1 and 1A?
At item 1 is Director of Planning and Community Development and Housing regarding standards for condominium conversions. At 1A is a council motion adopting condominium conversions density waiver policy.
Okay. Thank you very much. I guess we are going to Mr. Ghani.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council and the Housing Authority. In our last meeting on this topic, you raised specific questions that you asked staff from the two departments to respond to in a report with some options. Laura Stotler is here to give a staff report specifically, again, addressing the issues that you raised. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you? You want to give us an overview of this briefly, and then we'll go to our assembled joint two bodies here and see what kind of comments and questions we have.
Yes, Mayor Draymond and members of the Housing Authority and staff. On January 29, 2008, Council directed staff to return with a permissive policy for density waivers to allow them conversions of overdensity buildings generally. And also I asked us to identify criteria related to parking, density, quality of buildings being converted. We also requested for information concerning whether alternative rehabilitation codes would possibly encourage conversions of apartments in Glendale. And then you also asked for information concerning maintenance issues for conversions. Since December 20th, 2005, you have had a density waiver policy, and based on that, you've granted 9 projects density waivers. And there's information in your packet. It's actually Exhibit 2, and it includes an analysis of the parking and density information for the various buildings that were provided, as well as averages for parking and for numbers of units per building. And also it provides information comparing the units that have been converted with current codes. Regarding parking conversions, Council specifically requested information concerning the parking criteria, or the parking that was provided for the units that were granted waivers. And so we went through those, and it turns out there's an average of roughly 1.7 parking spaces per unit in the units that have been converted. So we did provide that analysis. However, would like to point out that Glendale has a very permissive code as far as conversions go when you compare us with neighboring cities. Our conversion code basically says you need to meet the parking at the time a building was built. It doesn't matter if you're over density. It's just the parking at the time it was built is the minimum requirement. Therefore, all the conversions that we have approved in the past, including those with density waivers, have all met the parking requirements in the subdivision code. However, if you wanted to consider a more restrictive policy, we did provide that. If you wanted to go by the average of what was actually approved for the conversions, it would be 1.7 parking spaces per unit. But again, that may not be all of the conversions. We had 2 of the density waiver conversions that had less parking than that. But we did provide that for you at your direction. Then we also had a request for identification of a proposed standard based on degree of inconsistency with current standards. And that, again, that is provided in Exhibit 2, and also it shows where the downzoning has occurred in the past And so you have degree of inconsistency with numbers of units that vary, because in certain areas of the city, you might have had a building that was built under the R750 standard, yet now perhaps the standard is R2250 or R1250. So the unit at the time it was built was consistent with the density in the area. However, now the degree of inconsistency can vary widely depending on what the rezonings have been in the past. What we have identified, though, if you are looking at some criteria, might be related to the locations of multifamily buildings in areas that have been downzoned for single-family housing. In certain areas, you may wish to consider a policy that would restrict conversions of apartment buildings in R1 areas, simply because if you have a building that's already in a multifamily area, it's expected that you'll have more than one unit per lot. If you have an area that is single family, it is one unit per lot. And so it's that degree of inconsistency that you may want to consider that as when you look at a waiver. Conversely, we have many areas in the city that were downzoned to single family that were previously multifamily. So there are certain blocks where perhaps the preponderance of units in the area are over density. It may be only one or two units that are single family left in the block. So in those cases, you might want to consider directing staff to potentially look at rezoning in those areas to make the zoning consistent with what's actually built on those blocks. But we've provided that information to you if you were to consider that. Some of the information is provided in Exhibit 3 as in the background of a colored map. It shows where all the multifamily zones are, and it outlines all the buildings that are over density, and you can see there's certain neighborhoods that it's actually the majority of units are over density, especially in South Glendale. You asked for information also on quality of approaches to conversions. And again, there's a lot of information that was provided to you in a report that was attached. That was a report that was prepared on June 6, 2006, or 2006. So we didn't repeat that information in this report, but it's there as background. And if we were going to look at building quality of approaches, such as utility requirements, the number of parking spaces, storage requirements, inspection requirements, the majority of those requirements apply whether you're a conversion or whether you're a new condominium. So we weren't proposing to make any changes to those. The only difference we were saying you might want to consider is that all new condominiums go through design review, and not all conversions do. In fact, only conversions that have a substantial change where the owner's changing the facade, those are the only ones that are actually required to go through design review. And in the past, it wasn't an issue because most of the projects that came through for conversions were higher quality apartment buildings. But in the last round of conversion applications that we saw quite a few buildings that perhaps didn't have a higher standard of development. The design wasn't quite there. So on a case-by-case basis, you may wish to direct those buildings to go through a design review and advice prior to granting a density waiver, or if you were going to grant a density waiver, have the design review board look at it and have their considerations forwarded to the zoning administrator. If the zoning administrator would make a decision then, considering the design review comments. And in terms of adapted reuse, we did a review of the City of LA's adaptive reuse ordinance. It applies in their downtown. We took a look at several ordinances related to adaptive reuse, and it appears to be a very effective tool in downtown areas or in redevelopment areas where there's some funding that goes into it. In California, we have a lot of laws, state laws related to disabled and disability access, and not all those laws apply in different states. In California, it really restricts our ability if somebody is perhaps changing the facade of a building where you might change the entryway, if you're going to change parking requirements in certain buildings, change perhaps access requirements. You trigger state laws that, once you trigger the state law, it's a larger expense and more requirements that fall upon the developer. So, for instance, if you change your building access, then you're bringing all the access up into compliance for you have to comply with the ADA requirements. If you change some of the parking requirements, you have to bring the parking up in certain areas to ADA. And there's a lot of variations. After I spoke with Stuart Tom, he said it's hard to make a generalization. It just depends on the degree of alteration that's being done to the project, what triggers the different improvements. So overall, we did not provide a proposed change based on adaptive reuse. It appears to be a much broader issue than just a condominium conversions of apartments. The tool perhaps would be more useful in projects where you're looking at changing the whole use of a building. So you have a building, perhaps it's a warehouse that you're converting to residential use. It may have much more applicability in those cases. And then for maintenance, that was the final issue that you had asked for us to look at. I know you've heard in the past from Sam Engel, and again, the previous report was attached that provides all the information about what some of the maintenance issues are. But the main one that we feel that staff could have an impact on is education to the HOAs, education to their boards, education to the owners on how to properly manage an HOA. Since they're private property, they're privately managed, issues such as setting maintenance reserves, those are ones that are up to the board, set by the DRE, and then it's maintained by the board. And it's really out of our hands since we are not involved in the DRE process. So we felt that we could be most effective as in taking an education role. And with that, I have included a proposed density waiver ordinance, or actually it's a resolution that would basically identify that a project must meet or exceed the parking required at the time of construction and must have no less than 1.7 parking spaces per unit as a criteria you may wish to consider. That a conversion project must be located within a multifamily zone. Again, you may wish to modify that. And that a project must be physically attractive, or council may direct the applicant's project to be reviewed by the design review board. And then in accordance with our code, all waivers are subject to the review and consideration of council pursuant to section 1632.090. And again, this proposed waiver would replace the one that was adopted by council in December 2005. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stadler. Let me go to my colleagues, and we'll see where the questions are and the comments. Mr. Quintero, you had your hand up first.
When did we do our downzoning? Was that about 3 years ago, or?
Well, no, it wasn't.
The most recent?
Oh, the most recent?
About 2.5 years ago?
That was in conjunction with the multifamily residential analysis, and that was just a few scattered locations only. But what Laura Stotler was referring to was the mass downzoning that happened twice in the past.
Right.
And what years did that happen? Does anyone?
I believe it was 1986, and then that was 1991 and 92, sometime around in there, for the hillside rezoning.
86 and 1991.
Right. The 1986 was citywide, and it related to multifamily zones. And then in 1991 and 92, again, the code was reviewed. They were looking for hillside standards, but then there were also some changes that were made in transitional areas, transitional zoning.
Okay. And this map is excellent. I'm wondering if there was also a way to, I mean, you've broken down the overall, the parcels and units and so forth, and you've gone by the 1250 and 2250, et cetera. I wonder if using the computer you could also do this kind of geographically. There was a way to maybe focus on some neighborhoods, for instance, east of Central, south of Colorado, that type of thing. That would be interesting to know in terms of some of the numbers attached to this map. What strikes me is the super high density east of Brand and north of Broadway, west of Central, north of Broadway, north of Glen Oaks. Those are in fact the highest densities in the city. You would have thought, for instance, they were south of Colorado, but really not. So kind of interesting how that works. But I would like to see if you can do some more statistical work and just get a feel for some of the individual neighborhoods. But overall, this is really a great help. Very well done.
Other comments? Mr. Weaver.
Well, I'll just comment in general. I thought in 2005 and since, we went to great steps to handle the condominium conversion issue. I'm not willing to give an inch on additional ones. One of the big things that we hear in this community all the time is the parking problems in the residential neighborhoods. There simply isn't enough space to park. You hear about garages filled with stuff rather than cars. Here we have apartments that were built with the older codes, requiring less parking. We're in a different era now where families have 2, 3, 4 cars. They're jammed on the streets. We hear stories of people having to walk 3 or 4 blocks to find a parking spot to go home. And we could possibly sit here and consider allowing all of these that are highlighted to convert, many of them, without adequate parking. In essence, making the situation worse from here to eternity. I just can't conceive of giving those opportunities. We said if you can meet the parking requirements, you can convert. If you can't, I can't see doing it. And we also know once those apartments are converted to condominiums, sorry about that. I thought I had it off. Please turn off all cell phones. Thank you. Put them on vibrate. We've heard about the fact if you have a condo association and there's problems, the city discovers problems in code enforcement, you got to get every condo owner in the place to go along with making any upgrades, whether in the seismic codes, fire safety, or whatever, which is a horrendous mess. And with all these areas that are highlighted that show the densities already, I don't see why we would open the door for more conversions when the bottom line on any conversion is so the owner of the apartment building can make money and leave town. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart to give an apartment dweller a home. No, it's money in their pocket that they can make. And I'm not going to sit here and make decisions based on economics. And half the people live in these apartments, I bet you more than half of them won't be able to even afford to buy the apartment they're living in. So I thought we settled this matter once for all, and here it is back again. Just tell you here and now, there's no way you're going to convince me to vote for any changes on what we've already done, and I don't see anybody in the audience getting up to push for this. So I think we ought to just say thank you for the report and go home.
Okay, with one vote to say goodbye to everybody, let me
Staff can stay.
let me also see what other thoughts there are. Is anybody else, Laura?
I just have a question. Did we get any complaints regarding the parking by the tenants or by surrounding neighborhood for those 9 units that were converted already?
I haven't heard any complaints at all on those 9 units that were converted. We did send out public notices that went to not only the tenants but also owners in the surrounding area, and no comments were received by the zoning administrator on those.
Mr. Weaver.
However, if there isn't adequate parking in those, they're parking out on the street. We're not making the situation any better by conversion. We're just continuing to put people on the street. It's not going to change a thing.
Right. Mr. Najarian and Mr. Yusefian.
Thank you. This is torture for me to deal with this condominium conversion issue, because I think there's no other issue that I think affects the quality of life in the city of Glendale more than permanently locking in individual-owned units in buildings that are obsolete. In buildings, as you've shown us, Laura, throughout the city, these are all overdeveloped areas, correct?
Correct.
And the darker color is the greater the overdevelopment.
Well, the darker color is the zoning, so the darker the color, the higher the density of the zoning. It's all the parcels outlined in red. Those are the ones that are the over-density buildings. Every one of those exceeds the density.
This is like Sisyphus. I feel like Sisyphus.
You want some help?
Do you know who Sisyphus
What kind of
was?
disease is that?
Sisyphus was condemned for not returning to the Greek heaven. He wanted to remain on earth, and his punishment was to roll a huge boulder up a mountain. Just when he got to the top, guess what? It slipped and it rolled all the way down, and he had to continue. This is what I feel like with this condominium conversion. It is torture for me. I think that it is incumbent on us, and there's nothing that council can do greater for the city of Glendale and the residents, especially in these affected areas, to stop any further condominium conversion, to permit these jammed, tight, dense apartment buildings that once they reach the end of their otherwise useful life, to revert to the appropriate density in accordance with our general plan and our zoning. But we're not doing that. By permitting conversions, we are creating mini fiefdoms, mini governments of homeowners associations that are going to live in perpetuity. It is inconceivable that a homeowners association will permit and vote and legally agree to dissolve their interests in the property and sell it and have it redeveloped at a later time, a redevelopment which would conform to what our councils before us have decided were the appropriate levels of development throughout our city. The rush for these condominium conversions that we saw, the hue and cry that we had 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was a complete and total aberration. It's an aberration. It was an artificial high. It was a junkie's high of free credit, no income, liar loans, and that's what gave the incredible demand for these types of units. We will never, ever see that type of free, loose credit again because our federal government is controlling the banks and our financial system. They will never let the market adjust as steeply as it otherwise would have, and they will never let the credit markets become as loose as we've seen them in the last 3 to 4 years. So we're dealing with something, in my opinion, that is never, this is an exercise in futility. We are never going to see adequate demand to make the conversion of these apartment buildings to condominiums become a reality. Now, did I hear you say that we should consider upzoning in certain areas to permit this? Did I catch some whiff of that?
I will, with Laura's permission, I speak for her. She did not say, nor did the planning department say you should.
But there was a suggestion.
If the issue of inconsistency of existing buildings in any neighborhood is one that you would like to consider, one way to deal with that, if there's a preponderance of a number of buildings that are over the zoning allowed, one way to deal with it would be to revisit those areas and see if the current zoning is appropriate. And maybe it should be allowed to have higher density.
Well, let's just pull out the white flags of surrender and say that we are never going to go back to what previous councils, and I think many on this council, envisioned for Glendale and the central areas to be a less dense, a more neighborhood-friendly with a higher quality of life. I mean, to go back and say, well, perhaps these high-density zonings are appropriate, to me is something that I will never vote for. And in theory, I don't think that anyone in the city is going to go for that. So I don't know. I think my position is fairly clear. I don't even want to see this thing. So I'm against anything. I'm in many regards right along with Mr. Weaver, and I think I've been consistent throughout.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to add one clarification. What I had said in the past, you drive down blocks where multifamily houses are in Glendale, and if on a street you see virtually all multifamily except one or two single-family, okay, that block is gone. It's going to be all multifamily. So that single-family home in there, let it go ahead and convert to a condo that meets code. To an apartment building or condo that meets code. If you go down a street and it's all single-family and there's one or two apartment buildings on that whole street, downzone that block because it's already zoned for multifamily, and we're just going to invite code-compliant apartment units or condo units to move in there and put more parking on the streets. You're not going to get them all into the parking garages. You're putting more on there. So downzone it, because one or two indicates what the zoning is. So that's what I've asked staff to look at and come back to us with. Where are those areas? We've all seen them. See, what's that one apartment building down here? We see all these old homes were built back in the 30s and 40s. They're all going to go unless we take an action to stop it.
Okay. Mr. Yusefian, you've been waiting patiently.
Thank you. I have a different view on this, by the way. All those dark brown areas that Mr. Quintero was talking about, most of those were built in the 80s. They're generally buildings that are probably about 20, 25 years old. They were built to code at the time, so I seriously doubt anybody's tearing those things down to an extent. I also, being in development business, I will tell you, nobody's going to go out there and take a 1930s apartment and convert it to condos, because they'll just sit there and nobody will buy them either, because the size of the units, the number of rooms that they have, and so on and so forth doesn't really do anything. I think the proposed condominium conversion standards that you have proposed, that staff has proposed, is one that I could live with. The only thing I would change, you would say, with a multifamily zone, I would also include a mixed-use zone. So it would be for multifamily or mixed-use zone, because we are trying to do that, and we keep forgetting to do that. On the other part is I had a question on the issue of noise attenuation. Can somebody enlighten me on that issue a little bit more? That talks about requiring the converted units to meet the noise attenuation standard without carpeting. How would they do that?
Well, you hit the crux of the problem. It's very expensive. A lot of times when the buildings were built, they assumed that carpeting was going to be provided. There are CC&Rs that require carpet to be provided in the areas that are not the kitchen and the bathroom. First thing a lot of owners do is they come in and they put in a hardwood floor, a tile floor, and the city doesn't enforce that. That is something that would need to be, because it's a CC&R requirement, is something that would need to be enforced by the homeowners association. And so a lot of the complaints that we receive on that is because the homeowners association hasn't necessarily required compliance with their CC&Rs. And so one of the items that was raised in a previous report was related to, well, how can you attenuate that? It requires either reconstruction or some other method to bring the sound down. And there's a variety of methods to do that. It could be quite expensive. And so it's...
Give me an example.
Well, they could put in subflooring to try and minimize it. They can put in a fake floor. They could re-engineer how the floors are connected, the joists. Very expensive. Is it possible? Yes. Is it practical? Probably not. And so that's why we haven't seen a lot of that happen.
And that's my issue. I think part of the problem in here is, I think if it was spelled out, it will be a little bit better. If you're going to have, most of these things are wood floors. You may require resilient ceiling on down below. They put the metal channels on and put the drywall in. That takes some of the sound. As they're out, they would put some kind of insulation. And also, it helps very much if on top of the wood you put 1.5 inches of lightweight concrete, and that also deadens the sound. So those two items will.
It relates to this when Councilmember Yusefian is.
Yeah, so those are, I think it needs to be spelled out. I mean, some of the ways to deal with this issue is going to be so expensive, it'd actually be cheaper for the guy to just tear down the whole building and start all over again. So we need to keep that in mind. I think that's a good idea to have what noise attenuation is, but we need to come up with at least a couple of ways of doing it practically that can actually be done. There's no way you can put another floor when you have only an 8-foot ceiling. You can't even code comply. 7.6 is the minimum requirement, so how are you going to do that? So I think that's very important as far as I'm concerned. The other thing that I am not so crazy about is requirement will include a sub-metering of the water services for each unit independently. Having been in a condominium or an apartment, a 52-unit apartment that I managed that converted into a condo, just trying to change all the pipes from galvanized to copper was difficult enough. Just trying to have a dual system and have all these extra pipes run, especially at a time that everybody's trying to go green, I will ask you to think about that aspect, the amount of energy it takes to generate copper and copper pipe. To just put in there for conservation purposes, if you look at its footprint on planet compared to the little bit of water you're going to save, I would say you do a lot more damage by doing that than the other way around. And also, it raises hell with the skin of the building. So that's one thing I'm not so crazy about. Although I do think that there should be an upgrade on the fire system. If you're buying a condo, there should be fire protection in there. I think that's a must for me. Outside of that, I am fine with this. The design rehabilitation, I think it's a good idea. The parking standards that you have come up with, the 1.7, if I'm not mistaken, we do this for new mixed-use projects. We have gone down from 2, what it used to be, and 1.7 used to be the parking standards. I think it was in 1980s, 1986, after 1986 was about 1.7. So that will be complying. And there's another way they could meet it. Sometimes you can include 2 one-bedrooms and make it into one, and that way you can maybe meet some of the stuff. I think the biggest thing on condo conversions that I have not seen in here has to do with the density. How are you dealing with the density? So if you're saying if they meet this criteria in your proposed section and they did not meet the density, you would give them the waiver. Is that what you're proposing?
We weren't proposing to make any changes then to the density. So if the building was over-dense and you were going to grant a waiver, that you were granting a waiver because it was over-density. Otherwise, our requirement would have been to comply with the general plan, the current general plan.
Right, but if they're over-density, then they have to meet this particular items, right? They need to be 1.7, they need to be in multifamily, and that would qualify them for a density waiver, which then at that point will come to council?
Yes.
Okay, and then we would basically deal with them.
Just like you were doing the other density waivers, correct.
Okay. Okay, I have a better understanding of that. Mr. Howard, you had a question, answers?
Actually, a point on the noise attenuation issue.
Noise attenuation, yeah.
2 things. One, the building code addresses the issue somewhat with minimum noise standards, and I forget the rating that the flooring has to be. And Stuart Tom can certainly articulate this better than I can. Our office did prosecute someone in the last few years for laying in a marble floor in place of carpet and creating some noise issues. There's actually provisions in the building code, if I can recall, where if an individual wants to lay in a flooring that may or may not meet certain standards, they can actually pay for and actually it's the party who usually lives below who can pay for a sound test to determine whether or not the flooring meets this particular minimum standard. So there are ways, I think, confirming what you've indicated, there are ways that may be less expensive than removing joists or adding concrete, where you can add certain types of flooring that does or may meet the minimum requirements for noise attenuation that exist on the market today.
Right.
I don't think it's as simple as walking into Home Depot, for example, and buying some hardwood flooring. You're going to have to buy some hardwood flooring that has within it certain kind of noise attenuation backing. There are tests you can perform to determine whether or not that would actually meet the standard.
All right, Mr. Hagan.
And related to the same issue, one of the reasons that planning staff do not necessarily propose specific items that would constitute noise attenuation is that we can set the standard that you need to meet the standard, but building department division staff will tell us that, well, even if you call out the material, the way in which the material is installed and is engineered is going to make all of the difference. We ran into this issue with double-glazed windows in the past when we wanted to meet standards set by the noise element. And the building staff said, no, we do not want to say these methods will achieve that, because the way that a contractor or an engineer executes that is going to make all the difference. Therefore, it's better for planning standards to set the standards, say you shall achieve this, and leave it to the building official and his staff to determine whether or not a building is meeting those.
Okay, so there is a code actually in building and safety that deals with that stuff, so you may want to call on that. Okay.
And it's also in the subdivision code.
All right, let me-
The noise attenuation standard that's in the subdivision code is the exact same one as the one that's in the building.
Housekeeping issue, Mr. Howard or Mr. Garcia. Ultimately, I mean, this is a joint meeting of Housing Authority and Council. Ultimately, though, we've had, take out the word ultimately, we have had joint meetings in the past where you have advised me that even though it is a joint meeting of the two bodies, the vote is not from the joint body. So can you explain to me whether this is one of those times or not?
This is one of those times where the motion is a council motion to establish essentially a policy similar to what you did back initially when we went through this first go-around with density waivers, where the council adopted a policy, whether it was evidence of having a conversion application or discussions with staff. This is another policy, at least the motion before you, which is a council motion, majority vote. Should the council desire any further changes, such as amendment to the zoning code, which may require 4/5 vote, or even amendment to the general plan, that would be something we would have to bring back to you in subsequent reports.
Okay.
Right now, it's council vote.
Okay. One of the reasons I asked that, and I have some comments I'd like to make, but aside from that, one of the reasons I ask for that clarification is because if there is not a consensus to even move forward on doing anything with this, some of the discussions about all of the construction elements and so on is kind of a moot point, and it's a rabbit hole to go down that we may not want to take the time to go down if there's no consensus to do anything at all here. And I'm hearing from a few of my colleagues on the dais that...
Well, you got two.
Two have expressed that they're not interested at all. So that's why I'm raising to this point. I have comments. Mr. Quintero has not yet commented, so I will wait for him and for Mr. Mincy as well.
Yeah, I'm not particularly interested in moving forward either. So.
All right, Mr. Mincy.
Well, it's all, as long as it's a council vote, I still agree that you should leave it like it is.
Okay.
Don't move forward.
All right. I will take that then as well, I can count to 5, and so I don't think there's been much movement since, but let me answer a couple of points that some of my colleagues have raised, and let me also make a couple of comments of my own, unrelated to previous council comments. One of the reasons that we're right back here, and I apologize for being part of the boulder that Sisyphus is pushing up the hill. I thought maybe you were going to go for the Prometheus analogy and say we're picking at your liver, but the reason is because you have some new council members, and I'm one of them. And this is a debate that I wanted to hear. It's a debate I wanted to be a part of. I understand certainly what you're saying, Councilmember Najarian, and it doesn't waver at all. You're quite right from what you had said before, and Mr. Weaver as well. But let me go to a couple of issues unrelated to the ones that Mr. Najarian raised, about parking, for example. You know, I'm sorry, I reject that analysis that was made here. The parking problem in Glendale is not because of and would not be because of condo conversion. Problem, in my humble opinion, with regard to parking in the city of Glendale has to do with the fact that we don't require, I've said this before on the dais, and some of my colleagues nod in agreement, but we never seem to ever get to a point of doing anything about it, and I have asked for it to be agendized. It hasn't come back yet. And that has to do with a parking ordinance. You know? And it's not just residential, it's also commercial. We say to a developer, you're going to build this building, or you're going to remodel your building or expand your building. Based on use and other things, here are the number of parking spaces you're required to have. And then they sublet their building, and those businesses have certain parking requirements that we require. And they show us a map, and it shows all the parking spaces, and then they promptly ignore it once we approve it. And all of those folks, whether it's construction vehicles or personal vehicles or employee vehicles, end up out on the street. And we do the exact same thing with residential housing. We have buildings, and we all know this goes on, where, and this is the one I hear most often from people who contact me to complain, oh, you're interested in our 2-bedroom apartment that's for rent, 2-bedroom, 1 bath, and we will lease it to you, we'll rent it to you for, $1,350 a month, unless you want the parking that goes with it, in which case we'll rent it to you for $1,650 a month, and you're a young family, and you go, you know what? I'll take it for $1,350, and I'll take my chances finding parking on the street. And then, very often, those same owners of those properties go ahead and lease that parking out to other people, not necessarily even for vehicles, sometimes for storage, very often for storage. And we end up with the vehicles on the street. I lived in South Glendale for a very long time. And when I rented in South Glendale, that's exactly what was going on in my building then, and it's the same thing that's going on now. And my routine coming home from work also consisted of circling the block for usually a half hour to find a parking space at the end of the day. And that's still going on. So I don't see condo conversions as the thing that is going to or does create that. It's the fact that we have all kinds of handy-dandy regulations related to parking, but we don't have any means of, or we have not established a means of enforcing. We say you have to have this parking, but then we don't require you to use it. Now, when we talk about bringing an entity into the city to rent, let's say, we're talking about moving a school into the former Cost Plus building on Brand, and we say, oh, you know what? We're going to clock what you're doing and make sure your employees are actually parking in that garage. We do it there, and we have a big debate about it up here, but when it comes to residential parking, we don't care. When it comes to commercial parking, we don't seem to care. And I could give you specific example after specific example that I know. So that's one thing, parking. The other thing that I want to talk about is the smart codes and there's several names for smart codes or alternative rehabilitation codes or existing building codes. In this report, it says that was brought up and that the reason for it was to talk about condo conversion, and that's just wrong. I know because I'm the one that raised the issue. I've been raising this issue since before I came to this council. Since I've been on this council, I've raised the issue 3 separate times. One in a meeting, which was one of the first staff meetings I ever had with Madeline and with Peter. And I talked about it then. I've talked about it in council meetings when I was chairing redevelopment, and I've brought it up the last time we were dealing with this, only as a side note. Not to say that that's the answer, but that I would like us to have a debate on this and look at this. Can you, Hassan, can you please tell me, in the research you did you guys look at Assembly Bill 2259? That's California State Assembly Bill.
No.
Dealing with existing building codes, patterned after New Jersey's program, Maryland's program, the same one that's in effect in Rhode Island, Delaware, Kansas, and guess what? California.
We looked at New Jersey, we looked at Maryland, and I looked at City of LA, and I had a discussion with Stuart Tom.
Right, and what Stuart Tom is talking about is within the context, at least as it's written here, in the context of condo conversions.
Correct.
That wasn't what I was talking about. I mean, these various triggers that he's talking about in here is exactly what that Assembly bill was dealing with. Impediments to creating affordable, not necessarily conversions for sale of housing. This is for reuse of existing buildings, not just for condo conversion. That is the least of it. It's existing housing stock, whether it's multi-unit or old single-family, and the reasons are to create an incentive for building owners or developers to reuse properties to the level of being safe buildings, just as we do with historic properties, where there is an alternative rehabilitation code. It's the exact same thing. We raise them to the level of being safe buildings. That's the term, the term of art, so to speak. Just as we do with historic buildings. And the idea is that it reduces blight, and it is not just in urban areas, and it's not just in redevelopment areas. And the idea is that we save resources. We're not tearing down a building and then cutting down a forest to put up a new building. Anyway, I would really like to, at some point, get some up-to-date research on this, because there are cities in California that are doing this. And that's why I'm saying I'm not sure. I think Mr. Tom might have been looking at basically saying, well, New Jersey and Maryland, they're different. They don't have these requirements that are in the state of California. That is not true, actually, and it has changed, is what I'm saying. They've had great success in many, many states, California as well. Petaluma was the first city in the state of California that did this, and others have followed suit, including San Diego. So, and according to your own report, aspects of it in Los Angeles. Now, whether it applies to condo conversions well, whether it adapts well to condo conversions is a different story, but we need to look at this. We need to look at this, especially given the economy we're in and the housing market we're in. That's my opinion, anyway, on it. So I don't know what the status of that Assembly bill was, and that's why I'm asking about it. It's not to trick you or challenge you. I'd like to know some more research about it. That was in the years 2000 to 2003. 2003, I believe, or 2004 is when Petaluma started doing their projects there, and San Diego not long after that. So I would like to look at that. Let's see, Mr. Yusefian had his hand up first, then Mr. Najarian.
From staff, if I want to convert a condominium apartment into condominium and it is over the density limit now, what do I do?
Well, the first step is you would need to apply for a density waiver, and we would apply the criteria that was adopted in December 2005. And that means you would need to show that you were the owner as of September or as of June 7th, 2005, and that you had taken substantive steps toward conversion before June 7th, 2005, whether that would be hiring an engineer to do your subdivision map or taking some other action. I believe some people even had done termite control
so
and
if I
upgrades
didn't
of
do
buildings,
anything
so.
prior to June of 2005, the chances are I will not be able to get my conversion, correct?
Well, correct. We would tell the applicant that you do not meet the council's criteria for a conversion waiver, density waiver.
Okay. And the reason I ask that is because I think, if I'm not mistaken, unless sometimes I don't recall correctly, this dais at least three of us, Mr. Quintero, me, and Mr. Draymond, asked that item to be modified to allow people who would like to come forward and want to convert in 2008 or 2010, they are looking at a different criteria. And if I'm not mistaken, that's why staff has gone back and written the criteria, which is, it is not time-based, it's actually based on meeting certain standards.
Exactly.
Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so my question to Mr. Quintero is, I'm trying to understand, Frank, you don't like their criteria, or you just don't want to do conversions anymore?
That's a complicated question.
Got all day.
Yeah, no, we really don't. I thought we were done. I think at this point in time, the best bet is to just go with what we currently have on the books. The only difference I see is commercial or other types of buildings that don't have housing currently. That, to me, is a different situation. But for the existing units, I think we can just go with what we have. That's the way.
Mr. City Attorney, let me ask you another question. Is this the appropriate time for me, by the way, is this appropriate venue, rather, for me to ask that something be agendized for council?
Certainly.
Okay. Let me ask that we agendize a look at alternative building codes in general. I've actually asked for this before, but it has not come back, so I'd like to ask that we do that. That is one thing. Second, the one thing I didn't do when I was talking about this a moment ago, and just take 1 second to do, and I apologize for having my BlackBerry. My personal rule is I never bring it to council, but in this case I didn't have time to go print anything off the web, so I'm just going to read it. One of the purposes for this proposed legislation in the state of California was the discretion afforded to local building officials by existing building codes can lead, in some cases, to costly or unreasonable requirements for the rehabilitation of underutilized older buildings. The creation of a California Building Rehabilitation Code Advisory Council, which is what this was dealing about, will help the state determine whether the adoption of rehabilitation guidelines for local governments to adopt will spur building rehabilitation, reduce costs, and improve building safety, and it goes on. So it deals with blighted areas and so on. So anyway, about a consensus here. I'm hearing from I hear three of my colleagues saying they're not interested in going further with this. That being the case, is there a reason to go further with this?
Can you count till
I'm
five?
sorry, Councilmember Najjar.
Before you unwind everything, I just have a question. How's the conversion at 601 Palm Drive doing?
I don't know offhand. I'd have to check on that one.
Spent some time on that one.
Spent a lot of time on that one. And it was
Remember, we were going to put low-income housing in. That didn't work. We were going to have a $250,000 grant to Habitat for Humanity. That didn't work. Council saw fit that we were really putting the screws to the poor developer. Here, just build it. Just go ahead. Has there been any action on that?
They did receive their tentative map.
Yes,
Are
but
they going forward with it?
I haven't followed up on that one in particular.
Does anyone know?
We can always check
Yeah,
building.
I don't want to spring anything.
We
on
can see
anyone,
if
but
they've submitted plans to plan check and whether they
This
received
is one of
building.
those boulders we carried up the hill several times.
Can't get the
times.
financing.
We can always check and see if
I'd
they've
like
submitted
if
for
someone
plan
could,
check.
at some later point, let me know whatever happened to that. Because I don't think anything's happened. I think this whole condominium conversion is perhaps best personified by what happened at 601 Palm Drive. A lot of hype, a lot of hopes for some substantial profits, but in the end, when the market stabilized and people got real about how loans were going to be made, it just didn't come to reality. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Let's find out.
Find out.
If you could get us a status report.
Their map is still good.
Well, not only just on 601, all 9 of them.
Let's do
Because
that.
it was, let's see,
Let's
how
get
many
an
of these
update
actually got...
on those 9, probably including that property.
Yeah.
Remember that one, though, so in particular.
Please include that in a memo to you all.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking.
Okay. It sounds to me like we do not have a consensus to move forward. Mr.
Move to
Yusefian.
adjourn for city council.
Well, whoa. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, just to recap, and I think this would be helpful for planning and other staff, what I'm hearing is the need to come back with an agendized item to discuss smart codes or other alternatives, as well as look at the alternative building codes in general. I know there's a historic building code, and there may be other alternatives as well.
Well, and
That's adaptive reuse.
It's not just adaptive reuse, it's a different issue. Yes, sir.
Well, I just say, I have several follow-up items, none of which relate to necessarily condo conversions.
Right, one is parking, the
Right,
other is parking.
parking,
That was the next one.
a number of items, the
Back to
status of the
this is-
existing condominium conversions, and we'll follow up on all of that, but I think most important is that there's no consensus, then the current policy as described in the staff report would remain relative to condo conversions.
That's
This
my
will be an
impression, too.
informational
Well,
report you're asking.
It's a
Which
different
means
question.
there will be no
First,
more
we're talking
condo
about
conversion.
This,
Yeah.
yeah. With regard to what Mr. Starbird is talking about,
Yeah.
the way I envision it for asking for it is informational, to see whether there is an interest in moving forward on it.
Okay.
But parking was another, and I just want to make it clear, I'm not talking about adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse and an existing building code or an alternative rehabilitation code is not adaptive reuse. Okay, that's what was in the report, but that's not what we're talking about. That's not what I'm talking about, anyway. Mr. Quintero.
Well, in terms of parking specifically, I'd be interested in looking at tying the individual residential units to the parking spaces.
And we have that on our follow-up list to
Right.
bring back to you. Mr.
Right.
Draymond did mention that before.
I'm sorry, Mr. Yusefian.
Actually, I think we had consensus on that item a long time ago.
You did. You did.
It's just that, for this item, what do we need to do, Mr. City Attorney? Make a
Nothing.
motion to
Nothing.
adjourn?
Nothing.
Well, essentially, that's where you're at.
No consensus?
There's no consensus. The existing
No
policy for
I'd like to
density
go on
waivers will
record
remain.
saying that I liked what Laura did. Thank you very much. You did a good job. I like your new proposed conversion standards. I think it was done very nicely. But nevertheless, today, I guess, I just end up to be on the shorter end. That's okay. Life goes on.
Move to
And
adjourn
with
for
that-
council.
I'll second that for council.
Move to adjourn for
redevelopment.
housing.
Well,
I mean,
council is adjourned, and
Second on housing.
And housing and adjourned.
thank you.